like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like all the time.
All right, Thomas Achord, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
Great, thanks for having me. Glad to be on.
Yeah, I'm really excited to finally get to meet you because you and I have, quite a number of friends in common. And so I certainly know about you, through that, and then as well as your reputation. But if you could you describe, who you are and what you do for my listeners?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Thomas Achord. I am a father, 5, husband, and I'm a simple man trying to live a quiet, peaceful life. When people ask me what I do, I say that I'm an adventurer looking for opportunities.
That's a fair answer, right? I'll give you that.
That's what Ulysses said in "O Brother, Where Art Thou?" when he was confronted by the Cyclops. He didn't know what to say, and that's what he said. So I like that answer.
Yeah, it's a good one. So obviously, this is an unpleasant topic. We don't need to get into the specifics, right? But you were at the center of a fairly significant controversy. I'll put it that way. So do you want to address that, even if only briefly?
Yeah, sure. So a few years ago, there were some people who found some old things I said, and they were upset with it, and they brought it to light. And that caused a great change in my life circumstances. And it's been quite a struggle over the years to get myself on my feet. And some of that's still going on, but I will say it provided a lot of good. Sometimes I have, I'm downcast, but overall, it's been extraordinary. It's been a blessing to my life. It's been a wonderful experience, believe it or not. It's my friends have drawn nearer to me, my family, and I to them. Every day I count myself a blessed man. The Lord's provided so much. And I feel that I have a clear understanding of who I am, what I believe, and what I'm doing in life now. It's been really a providential thing over these past couple of years, and I'm thankful for it overall.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, right? Because obviously no one wants bad things to happen to them, right? It's almost stupid to say. But
sure.
Looking back on it, there is something to be said for the fact that that process can be refining, right? Like the analogy in scriptures, oftentimes that of a crucible, right? Kind of burning away the dross. And
right.
Again, it's something to be avoided, right? Being, doxxed and kind of dragged in the court of public opinion is you wouldn't wish it on your enemies.
Right.
But yeah. I think that's a very, measured take on it. So I'm curious, right? Obviously you got involved in, shall we say, non-standard internet politics. What was that process like? Sure. Like, what were you interested in, as a young man? Were you always political, and what motivated you to bring your voice to the table, so to speak?
Sure. I think the internet for me was a strange world in the early 2000s, and I really had no interest in it. And what I say here, I'm saying what things that influenced me. Don't hear me say I'm blaming or excusing things. But I recall, for instance, one book I read when I was at seminary by Al Mohler, and it talked about how the minister, I forget the title of it, but it was something about the minister in the digital age or something. And he strongly advocated for people who want to be Christians and influence the public. That's what Al Mohler, he's the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where I went to seminary. He would say, you need to be in public all the time, influencing people. And he said, you need to be online. Straight up. If you're not able to do that, it's kind of like not being on the radio during the age of the radio, or not being on television during the age of the television, and so on. And so I thought, okay, I'll be online, and I'll try to be influential online. And I think for me, though, the real political galvanization began in 2014, 2015 with the rise of some really harsh politics coming from the left, and harsh responses coming from the right, and then the rise of Trump, the campaign that came about, and all of the problems that were exacerbated there. We had not just from him, but there were protests, and there in the streets, and there were churches completely siding with the protests, as destructive as they were. There was a lot going on in the church during this time as well that was anti-American, anti-Western, anti-white, and people were just kind of winking at it, and or they were sympathizing with it. And I felt that this was unbalanced in how the complaints of other demographics are considered. I felt that this was inconsistent with who I am. Like even in my own family makeup, I have one family member who is white, and one family member one parent who's white, and one parent who's not white. And so there was like this dichotomy inside of myself too. Like on the one hand, I'm being told by my country, I'm being told by all of the leading academic luminaries and by politicians and even by the church that I'm supposed to feel one way for one side of me, but I can feel pride and respect and glory in the other part of me. And I thought that's just, I can't live this dichotomy, right? This cognitive dissonance. I can't do that. And so these things in the early 20 teens began to kind of swirl and propel me into, I guess I would say, a political awareness. Whereas before that, I didn't care who was president. I didn't follow it. I didn't watch it. I didn't vote, even though I was old enough to vote. And but now I'm gaining an interest in it during that time.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because you and I are on different sides of a generational divide, right? I'm older, Gen Z, and to me, I think that the first like real political event, not to say that I remember, right? Because I grew up listening to daytime conservative talk radio, but the first event that felt kind of like real and kind of unique to me, like I remember distinctly where I was watching it, was Trayvon Martin, right, and the result from that. And again, I was fairly young. I didn't have a super developed brain at the time, and as many YouTube comments will tell you, I still don't. But nonetheless, right, there's this realization that the civics class version of how America works and how politics works is completely incorrect. Right? That you were given a sort of gimped set of tools, right? The things that you were taught seem to be deliberately untrue, right? And again, growing up, I felt this kind of frustration with the conservative movement. I remember, earlier, right, during the first Obama election, all of the conservatives who were absolutely sure John McCain was going to win. And then 4 years later, Mitt Romney was going to win. And as a kid, right, I just looked around and I was like, I'm sorry, this isn't happening. This isn't real. There's no way this man, can beat Obama. He's hopeless. And, the going through those kind of series of massive left-wing cultural victories, whether it's Obergefell, pick your poison on whichever culture war issue, it seemed as if conservatives were just giant losers. Right? They were eternally, just getting rolled, absolutely demolished. Mm-hmm. And so, when I was in high school, right, during the whole Trump phenomenon, that was really exciting and interesting, right? That was a unique thing. It seemed like, okay, like let's run this experiment. And then watching that first presidency largely accomplish absolutely nothing. I mean, it created immense amount of cynicism. And I mean, I think a combination of that and, having enough narcissism to decide that maybe I have something to add to the conversation, right? Pulled myself and, other young men onto the internet, because where else are you going to find real conversations, right? Where else are you going to talk about interesting issues? Because the kind of controlled the House conservatives, right? They're the same people who were, screeching about McCain or screeching about Romney, absolutely sure that this was the thing to save America. And it's very clearly captured. There's nothing there to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's something that also developed for me during this time that aligns with that is I feel like for me around 2009, 10, 11 is when my mind began to become more inclined to academic knowledge, book knowledge, and sort of philosophical mode of thought. And I began to read a lot during this time, and I began teaching political philosophy as well in the early 20 teens. And so, uh, and I was reading a lot of history during this time and teaching history. And so the cycles of history are in my mind, the ups and downs, the whoop and wharf of time, the advances that are made by a politician or a general, and then ultimately having setbacks that destroy that person as well. So when I went into the Trump era, let's say, I already had in my mind the idea that if he's really this world altering figure that's going to change America, it should look like these things that I've read in history. And it doesn't look like that entirely. It looks like there's going to be, he looks like he's foul mouthed, for instance, or he's just really willful, but he's a businessman. He's not a general. He's not going to really smash things and destroy things and change with this future looking vision. And I kind of had that in the back of my mind, but I didn't want to say that. And I still kind of don't want to say that because I have a lot of friends, and I guess people on my side are super optimistic about Trump and what he's going to do and what he is doing. I would say people might call me black pilled. I don't think that's the case. I'm more of a real pilled, where I look at this and say, okay, well, if this really was like even right now what Trump is doing with destroying things, it would look, in my opinion, it would look different. It would look like our friends are being put in positions of power, for instance, instead of merely destroying things, which is kind of like, I guess, the libertarian ethos. It's like, hey, let's just tear this stuff down. But a more right-wing ethos is, well, let's destroy things, but let's build up our own stuff too, like, and put our side in power. And that's not happening. And so anyway, that's just an example of my kind of realistic take into the Trump era. And there was also the ethnic component, the identitarian component also. And there's Black Americans, there's white Americans, there's Mexican Americans. And so those dynamics also factor how I viewed the first Trump presidency and the second one. And for me, I see America as like the idea of we're going to deport people, for instance. That may happen, but there are tens of millions of Mexicans here, and to deport are just brown people generally who are not white Americans. And so to talk about deporting all of them or the majority of them, I think there needs to be a more realistic approach to what's actually going to happen and what's not going to happen. So I don't have my hopes set for some kind of, even though people might like to believe that I do, I don't have my hopes set for some kind of, mono-ethnic nation state. I think, I have a little more realistic take on that. So I wouldn't say that I've been disappointed in Trump because I didn't have higher hopes than that sort of realistic assumption, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that my opinions are largely the same, right? I don't regret my vote. I think that didn't really matter much for me. My state went one way. But at the same time, given a binary choice, it was, a rational one. And to be honest, I'd love to be wrong, right? If I look like an idiot, but the West is saved, fair enough, right? I'm willing to make that trade. But I think that to me, there are sort of two orders of issues we're facing, right? The first is the fact that the country is sort of hilariously mismanaged, right? We have a lot of very stupid policies just mandated, at the point of a gun. And, Trump might well fix those things, right? We have, Doge saying that we spent all of this money, promoting a, bizarre sort of Dr. Frankenstein research. If we got rid of that, would the country be better? Yes, fair enough. But on the other hand, right, we have deep, I would say like civilizational level issues, right? Questions about like, well, one, what is the nature of a citizen? What is the nature of a man? Even, right? How ought we to relate to, relate ourselves to God, relate ourselves to the idea of, being in culture?
Hmm.
And I don't see Trump as addressing those, right? I
Right.
simply don't. Again, I'd love to be wrong, but I don't see it happening. And
Yeah.
so I don't regret my vote, but I think it's important, right, to, as you say, adopt a realistic view towards it. And it's
Sure.
difficult, right? Because, you mentioned earlier, right, like these are our people. I love these people. I have a great deal of
Right.
affection for them. But their assumptions about the world are largely incorrect, on any number of issues. And there's sort of a baked in political, naivete in it, right? There's sort of a baseline incorrect assumption about how politics really writ large, but specifically American politics works. And so I'm
Yeah.
curious, right? You mentioned that you taught political philosophy.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, right? What was that like for you? What thinkers did you pull from? What sort of
Oh, wow.
grand narrative did you write? And, how does that differ from, what you would be taught in, let's just say civics class at any random high school in Texas?
Well, that's a big question. I think that the overall approach that I took was I wanted the students to read the texts, the original texts for themselves before they read an interpretation of those texts or even a summary of the text. And of course, today, the first thing the student is going to do is going to go to some summary website or use AI now and just like, what did Plato say about this? So I don't have to read it. So I would try to make the students read the text. I got into classical education, and one of the theories of classical education is that the text is the teacher. So you need to read Homer more than you listen to me talk about Homer. And and of course it is also important to read the text with someone. What you read is important, but also who you read it with is important. And so what I would try to do is help the students basically just understand. For instance, Plato's Republic is one book we would read, and we would just read chapters of it. But I think some of the themes that I would try to focus on were, yeah, political realism. So not political theory as like aspirational, idealistic politics about what should be and what ought to be, but more of the study of what is. So I took a kind of an Aristotelian approach, I would say, where he's kind of like, hey, to understand politics, let's go observe man in his natural habitat, right? And everywhere we see man, he's gathering in groups. So man is a political animal. And I would do that throughout the ages. But I did focus on conservative and Christian texts. I have behind me here on this little corner shelf some a bunch of different political philosophy readers, and one of them is it goes through the Middle Ages. It's pretty good. And I would try to focus on like the ideal like Christian society. This is what Christians teach about morality and so on and so forth. And then this is what actually happens in the world, and how do we adapt those two things? And has it ever gone too far, where we've chased our ideals too far and we've left the nature of man far behind? Or have we ever just been too realpolitik, and then forgot about morals, too Machiavellian? I've also, especially in the modern period, when we would talk politics, I used a lot of Russell Kirk. I think he has some accessible books for students, especially when it comes to the American order. I think it's called Ordered Liberty or something like that. It's a black book with like a bell on the front. It's by Russell Kirk, and it's a really good one. But the idea of ordered liberty. So people today want freedom, but we need order, and those two things are kind of going in different directions, right? So what's the balance between the two? Also, liberty and equality. So if everyone's free, we're not going to be equal. And if we're all made to be equal, then we're not free. So and I would put this to the students, like, which do you prefer? If you had to choose, if you were in sports, would you rather choose that everybody gets a trophy, or that some people do and some people don't? And are you okay with there being losers in society? And how do we account for losers? How do we, like with jobs, Like for instance, with the free market situation, it's a lot of competition, and you have a lot of losers. And if you lose your job, I mean, well, good. Say like the free market economists, great. You'll be allocated. Your resources will be allocated to more productive ventures. And it's like, okay, well, does that actually happen, or does Paul lose his job and become an alcoholic, and he loses the farm and the house, and we get divorced and the town collapses? Like, what actually happens is different than like the theory that that people have. And so I would put some of these main questions in front of students, and we would wrestle with them in the texts themselves. And I hope it was fruitful. I hope it was fruitful to them. I know it was fruitful to me. I felt like education, teaching, being a teacher, was like the education that I never got, because I was not the best student in school at all. In fact, I don't remember reading many books in school. I remember reading Romeo and Juliet and a lot of Garfield in school. So yeah, being a teacher was really my second education, personally.
There's something to that. A mutual friend of ours talks, I guess, a lot about ideology. And he defined ideology as a new idea which will save the world, quote unquote. And contrasting, what you said, which is observing man, right? How does man act? We can make conclusions from that. It's 180 degrees reversed. That might have been redundant, of the idea that we will construct a conceptual paradigm where we've optimized society, where we will determine these are the variables we're looking to maximize. We will design a system around that. And I think that that's an interesting thing to compare and contrast sort of the pre-French Revolution world and the world after it. That even, right-wing systems, pick your poison of, fascism or the others, are still ultimately modern, right? Are still ideological.
Right.
And so I think that it's a very interesting project, right? To sort of strip back not only the first order propaganda, right? That you should be accepting of sexual minorities, that you should be obsessed with equity, but also stripping back the primary layer of ideology, right? Of conceptualizing the world in that mode. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah. I think, again, going back to the idea of classical education, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're saying, but trying to put aside the interpretation or summaries that we put on classical texts and just put the text themselves in front of people, especially in their time and context themselves, and let them wrestle with sort of these thought experiments that were real, lived experiences for people long ago, so that when we come to our own age, we can possibly see through some of the propaganda ourselves, because we're like, hey, Greece dealt with this long ago. How can I apply the lessons back then to what's happening right now? And that's sort of like a higher level, analytical comparison exercise. But I think that gets at what you were saying. And that's something that we did also. I found for me, teaching through the modern period, it's really bleak. I mean, you can see this better with literature. A lot of literature in the modern period, it's super dismal and sometimes nihilistic, or it has just really terrible view of man, like an anthropology that we're just naturally savage and evil and brutish. And I found myself giving into that with political philosophy as well. We would focus on how terrible communism was, or how terrible fascism was, or whatever, statism, totalitarianism. And then that's it. We're just done. Like, that's the end of the class. And I thought, this is not good. This is not good for students to go through and have no hope. And so I would try to give them some kind of positive political philosophy at the end of the class. Like, we end on a positive note, just not like the last week, but like the last several classes, where we study things and apply ancient wisdom to modern context. And I'm not sure if I always succeeded in that, but that was my goal. So it's not necessarily addressing the idea of propaganda, but and seeing through layers of things that are presented to us. But I do think that the 20th century, I mean, there's books like 1984. There's every war movie of World War One. There's Lord of the Flies, and that really encapsulates, and also like the whole civil rights narrative and the narrative of everyone that lived in America prior to the 1960s, where we finally fixed ourselves. It's this really dismal take, the 20th century, on humanity, and I try to combat that by showing that there are better ways to view man as an anthropological being, like our very nature. There's better ways of conceiving political science, and ones that actually have purchase in history and that could apply to our world today. Again, I don't know how effective I was in that, but that was some of the things I did.
There's a through line there, right? In forcing, I'm going to use a a harsh term, right? In forcing students to index with primary sources, you're stripping away the baked in presentism, the idea that all human history is a slow upward climb to the right as number gets bigger, and so you can just discard the wisdom of previous eras.
Right.
And what you realize when you interact with these texts is effectively, even if technology changes, man maintains, it's a constant, right? Human nature is what it is.
Right.
And to a certain degree, that's sort of the essence of a certain strain of conservatism, right? That I have a great deal of sympathy for. And I think that that's very much the value in a classical education. I was classically educated. It was incredibly impactful in my life. Let's be honest. That's why I'm here, indirectly. And to me, it's an interesting thing, right? Looking at education, because, and maybe you can speak to this, but I've become very skeptical of the idea of mass education. Because I look even at my graduating class, right, which was very, very small, right? 30 kids, private school. So you'd assume you're getting some sort of selection in that. But even among that specialized population, right? Even among that, kind of whatever you want to say, top 10%, right? Parents obviously care. There's, these are right-wing, conceptually, right, families. The amount of people that those values sunk in, right, that it actually affected them,
right,
was still a minority, right? And then you compare that to the entire population of all people who are given an education in America.
Right.
And you start to get a little cynical about the whole thing. Do you see what I'm getting at there, Thomas?
Yeah. I think that, I understand the cynicism, and personally, I think I began to grow cynical as well. Just my personal journey, whatever it's called, life in the late 20 teens. In fact, it was the first time I taught in a classical school, the very first class. I loved classical education. I had started devouring it myself prior to getting into it. And when I walked into the first classroom, I remember I thought everybody's here to devour the classics, to gain wisdom, to rebuild the cathedral, and it was totally not the case. It's completely not the situation at all. And it wasn't just that school. It was if you go to the classical school conference, that's where it's at. That's where everybody feels like that. But when you go to the classical schools, the parents, the teachers, not all, but there's a sizable portion that they're there to avoid the hellscape of modern education, which is fair. They're there because their friends are there, their social circle's there. Many kids from the church go there. It's a safe place. It's a good place. We're going to teach virtue and kindness and things like this. But the higher ideals of classical education and also, as I think you're alluding to, sort of the aristocratic nature of it in history, are not necessarily in the hearts and minds of the core of what's happening I think across the board. And it's kind of, what can people do though, really? Because classical education for a long time, uh, always until sometime in the 1900s, it was for the few. Everybody else went, and if you got an education at all, it was scant, maybe until the 5th or 8th grade max. But you were going to be a worker in your life, and so the classical education was for people who were not going to be laborers, and whose lives were already kind of laid out for them with family wealth and positions, so on and so forth. And when mass education came along, you have to account for the fact that all of these people are still going to have to go get jobs. So you can sort of give them a liberal education in the sense of like, hey, we're going to be well-rounded. You're going to learn some geography, some math, some writing, a little bit of civics, and some English grammar, and then you're going to go on your way. You're going to start tech training, college and career, and it gets earlier and earlier now. Like ninth graders, I see a billboard where I live. Ninth grade, you can enroll in college classes, and the idea is get a job and make money. And sometimes classical education people, they get upset about this. I saw one really influential guy who's part of like classical learning stuff. He said he had like this tweet that said the 800s BC class, education was cultivating virtue. 300 BC, cultivating virtue. 200 AD, cultivating 1800 AD, cultivating virtue. The 21st century, college and career. And I thought, well, yeah, because who were they educating for all of those past years? It wasn't the masses of people who have to work. It was the few. Like, for instance, most women, almost no women got an education for all of human history. Some did, but most didn't. And even among men, most men didn't receive this sort of education. Plato's Republic, even, if you think about it, like Plato imagines the ideal republic. What is the perfect world? If you could imagine a perfect world today, what would you imagine? If you ask that to anyone today, it's a world where everyone is equal. Everyone has everything, right? All possessions, all knowledge. But long ago, even Plato's Republic, the ideal republic is more real than our ideal. It's one where, well, look, we can only have a few at the top. Everybody else is going to work. That's Plato's Republic. And the education follows. The people at the top, the few, the philosopher kings, they're let out of the cave. They get the classical liberal freeing education. But everybody else, you're going to learn bricklaying, you're going to be a plumber, you're going to be this, you're going to be that. And, no one wants to be forced and told what to do. We don't like the idea of somebody dictating this kind of stuff. But that was his ideal. And I think that's the sort of thing that happened for most of history. Most people, like for instance, I know a guy who's a bricklayer. He's from Mexico, and we were doing some work at one point, and I asked him, the way he's working, it's beautiful to watch him work. It's like a fish, seeing a fish swim in water. This guy, and I said, he's 36 right now. I said, how long have you been laying brick? He said, 19 years. I'm like, 36 minus 19. What is 36 minus 19? He's been he didn't finish school, like grade school. And he started doing construction work with his father, with his family members, and he's better than anybody in the area today. Now, should he have gone off to college? Should he have gotten a classical education? I don't know. But that's what's happened. And I can say this too. Sorry if I'm going on long, but I have thoughts about this. You will find almost every single young man, when he turns 14 or 15, his interest in grade school education drops off a cliff. His interest in sports, and if he were a little more aware, his interest in making money and independence, his interest in being seen as a man skyrockets. And if given the opportunity, almost all of the, not all, but almost all such young men would gladly finish school or like somehow be done with it and go into enter the world of men, skill, responsibility, respect, payment, independence, ability, like means, financial means. They would love it, love it, love it, love it. And it just so happens that historically, that was the time, that was the age in which the sort of prep schools that were available to most children would end. You would go to school until you were maybe in 8th grade, and if you showed promise, then you would go off to some kind of college prep school somewhere, some academy, or go with some tutor. And if not, you would go back to your farm, your father's farm or your father's shop. And it was around 13 and 14. And that's a lot. You can see this in history. Even the way that Latin instruction was set up and Greek instruction, things like this. Even the way that Greek is set up today to be taught, it shows that this was the case long ago, because you had to learn Latin first. So Latin always comes in forms that little kids can learn, but not Greek, because Greek was for college, and not everybody went to college. And so, and Greek was often taught in the year between you finished your grade school and the year you went to college. And so you get this really quick shot of Greek, and that's how Greek's still taught in many textbooks today. So anyway, I know I'm chasing rabbit trails here, but I think that the problems with classical education and just education generally reflect that we're trying to apply this ancient aristocratic model to a modern democratic context, and they just don't fit together.
Right. You're taking an aristocratic model and porting it to an era of mass and scale. I noticed that oftentimes there was a gap between the stated and revealed preference of parents involved in classical education. The stated preference would be things like, oh, I want my children to be well educated. I want them to be, Renaissance men. But what that really means is I want my kids to go to a good school and to be upwardly mobile, upper middle class members of society. And while those things can be related, they aren't necessarily 100% related. And especially during, shall we say, the 2020 era, that became apparent. That when there was a cost to being associated with things old European men said, that became very uncomfortable. And you saw a lot of institutions, I can think of two, that got very uncomfortable with that started making cuts, started making sacrifices, because the parents and some of the administration were more concerned with their revealed preference, which is going to good, quote unquote, colleges, than their stated preference, right, which is to provide a classical education. And I think that gap is a problem, because these private schools are businesses, right? And their consumers want effectively a prep school education. And if those consumers start to get uncomfortable, if there's a social cost associated that they are unwilling to bear, then that school goes away. One of the other things, and I'm curious if you noticed this as well, is it seems like a lot of conservative Christian schools of all varieties started to experience a lot of problems during the pandemic, because students whose parents were primarily interested in their children going to school at a physical location started applying to Christian schools. And those parents may have had almost nothing really in common with, conservative Christians whatsoever. They simply wanted their kids to go to school. And so, in an institution that I'm close to, you can almost see this, right? Where there's this kind of wave of, students who have very driven parents, but not necessarily very conservative parents. And so you have these kind of like latent, single girl boss mothers, right? With one or two kids, kind of smuggled in. And I think that because many of these are businesses and operate on, let's be honest, relatively thin profit margins,
Yeah, yeah,
it was a poison pill they weren't prepared to deal with.
yeah. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough when you have any kind of business. There can be mission drift. That's why you need things like mottos, which may sound cheesy, but you need things that repeat to yourself, like, what are we doing? Because if you don't know what you're doing, you're chasing money. That's what you're doing. And whoever has the most money is where things are going to go. And I think that's the case in many instances with politics, with denominations, with Bible publishing, with schools. And there's also a level of compassion. We want to have compassion on this poor family or these people who were ousted from their school and they don't have anywhere to go now. But it's also, hey, enrollment needs to go up, tuition needs to rise. We need to be able to pay our electricity bill, and and that gets into everything. What kind of math books we use. I mean, that it's every, and I don't mean how much the math books cost. I just mean, look, this math book is too tough. Kids are not doing well. Parents are upset their kids are failing. They're paying tuition so that their kid can fail. And then oh no, now the math book's too easy. We need to be competitive. We need, so it's like it's a balance and how you manage these things. And frankly, I have a lot of compassion for anybody who's running an institution, because it's like a church during COVID. Do you close down, or do you stay open? And are the people going to support you in your decision? And if is it a smart decision, or does the church fold because you lose tithes? And so these sorts of things are super tough, and they're not always driven by ideology either. So people aren't always like, we have to shut down to obey the government. I'm a liberal and I believe everything the government's. That's not what most people, especially small businesses. A lot of small businesses. We're talking for schools. A small school is a couple hundred kids, and you are on a shoestring budget, and you're doing what you can to survive, and yet you're also trying to pursue the mission of providing this excellent education. So there are some schools that are more compassionate, like I mentioned, where it's like evangelical outreach. We're going to take in the wayward and the lost. We're going to take in the most ill-educated child at any level. And and of course that's like a teacher's. Logistically, it's a nightmare, because the kid is in a third grade reading level, a sixth grade math level, no Latin, and then you have some other homeschool kid, and they have memorized all of Veritas's publications. Like, they know everything, and they come in and they're expecting you to be just as into it as they are. But you're also trying to have this outreach mission to these other kids who are kind of, stragglers. So it can be a mess sometimes, and difficult to navigate these dynamics, for sure. And then COVID didn't help. I say COVID, the way that COVID was handled was a complete blunder for small businesses. And this happens, if you're a student of economic history, you'll know that anytime there's some massive government, like a crisis, like the Great Depression or the recession of 2007 and 8, the government steps in to help. What ends up happening is that the only people who can survive the new mountain of regulations are the massive institutions. Walmart can survive. The chain restaurants can survive. Your mom and pop's grocery stores or restaurants can't survive. So the massively funded schools can survive. The charter schools can survive. But your homeschool co-op or your small Christian classical school can't survive. So it's tough to navigate all of this, for sure.
Yeah, I think that this is something that's obviously endemic in public education, where you literally cannot fail a student. You have this spiraling problem of discipline, of ability level, which honestly, let's be honest, has been made much worse by mass immigration. You have children who can't even speak the language, who have a translator in tow at least some of the time. and obviously aren't doing very well. And it makes education practically impossible. There's a sense in which technically almost everyone can read, but you could make the argument that we effectively have the exact same literacy rate, that humans have had for the entirety of recorded history.
Right.
We've just reinvented illiteracy with extra steps, to phrase it in kind of a comedic way.
Well, no, that's true. And I think what you're getting at is there's complexity to what you're saying, but it's all supportive for what you're concluding. You can teach the whole population to read, but will they continue to read afterwards? Right? And in fact, there's a famous essay by a lady named Dorothy Sayers. It's called "The Lost Tools of Learning." It's supposedly this essay, written in the early to middle 1900s, is what got the at least the Protestant version of classical education going in the 80s and 90s. And it's, if you read any book, early book on classical Christian education, they will reference or actually reproduce this entire essay in full in their book. And she argued that merely teaching students to read is not enough. You have to teach them how to think about what they read. So this is the lost tools. What are the tools of learning? The ability to acquire knowledge, like the ability to think, the ability of the mind to latch onto knowledge, to digest it, assimilate it, and then do something with it. So what we're doing today, she argues, Dorothy Sayers argues, and this is back in the 40s when she wrote this book, or this essay, what modern education does is it only accomplishes the first task of education, which is it puts the raw facts in the mind for the purpose of, it's like memorize this and regurgitate it for a test. And that's entirely what a lot of sciences are, for instance. Almost all science textbooks are jammed packed with so much information, and they highlight all the terms and things for you. All you're doing is memorizing. You're never being taught to correlate, analyze, evaluate, compare, and categorize things. You're just taught to memorize the categories, not to how to categorize. Nor are you taught the next. So that's the second stage is analysis, logic, and then the last stage is rhetoric, like invent something, create something, express yourself, change the world, improve the world in some way, solve problems in the world with this knowledge. And that's the most difficult step of all. Modern education is just the first one. And when it comes to reading, as you're discussing, Dorothy Sayers actually says it's actually terrible to teach everyone to read if that's only what you do, because then their minds are subject to being controlled by whatever they read. Do you see? That's like, if we teach them how to read, but we don't teach them how to think about what they read, how to think it through, then after teaching them to read, we can just produce lots of propaganda and they'll believe whatever we say. And Dorothy Sayers is not the first person to think about this. So she's not like abstractly thinking. I think she references Mussolini having done this to the Sicilians. Not a knock against Sicily, but apparently in the 1920s or something, the literacy rate in Sicily was super low, and he couldn't propagandize them as well as he could other Italians. And so he said, we need to get these Sicilians on board. Someone get over there and teach them how to read. And they couldn't. I mean, think about what happens in war, at least in World War I and II and other times. They would drop a bunch of leaflets for the soldiers and the population to read, so that they would get a message from the opposing force to think a certain way. And there are many, many instances of this throughout history. Like if all you're taught is how to read, but not how to think through what you read critically, you're actually being miseducated. You're being misled, and it's really, really bad. And so I think, today when we think, okay, we need to get the literacy rate up. It's like, well, do we? What's the purpose? So that these people can learn to read receipts and be clerks at the grocery store or something? I mean, like, not that that's bad, but I mean, is that all we're trying to do for education purposes? Or are we trying to educate people to nobler aspirations of humanity, to stand upright and tall like dignified humans in their souls, in their minds, in their hearts? Are we trying to get them to see something beyond themselves and understand higher truths? Or are we just trying to propagandize them? And I think what happens, you can see what happens. Most people settle back down to an 8th grade, 6th grade level of reading after high school. After college, even, they don't read much again. I don't have the statistic in front of me, but it's something like if you read like 3 books a year, you're reading more than the average American. It's something like that, very, very low. And I mean, just walk into Books A Million or Barnes and Noble, and the vast majority of books are not geared to appeal to your mind, let's say. So I mean, what is literacy, right? Like, you can decipher letters in a row. Is that literacy?
Excuse me, I had a coughing fit. There's definitely something to that, right? I've recently been kind of darkly fascinated with Book Talk, right? Which is the community of women who basically read smut and talk about it on social media. And I'm not on TikTok, but I've become aware of this. And
I was going to ask, like, what are you listening to?
Well, the reason I've become aware of it is because I would, go to a coffee shop to work or whatever and see, young women carrying around these massive tomes. We're talking like 600-700 pages. And so just, a little bit of curiosity. I was like, all right, let me Google that, right? That's weird. And the answer is it's just smut. And it's incredibly poorly written smut to the degree that it's actually kind of comical, right? Like it's fun to go through the Wikipedia for all of these like bizarre, fantasy universes, just because it's very clearly written by people who I, for the sake of their grammar, hope they are children. They might not be, but nonetheless, even the relatively small percentage of people who do read, right? It's a minority activity. What are they devoting those resources to? And the answer is slop, right? Absolutely nothing. Nothing that's actually worth investing your time in. And you could make the argument that that's a fairly human thing. Humans have always been, on a Pareto distribution, and I'm certainly sympathetic to that. But again, it brings up the question of what is the point of an education? Is the point of the education simply collecting a series of skills? Because if that's the whole point of an education, there are remarkably easier ways to do that.
Sure.
You had a very high literacy rate. I mean, honestly, probably higher than it is now in the system without state-funded public education.
Right. And to your point, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, finish that thought.
The Federalist Papers. These guys who wrote the Federalist Papers, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, they were published in the newspapers of the day. This wasn't some scholarly exercise just for a few professors. This was in the newspaper for the common man and woman to read who bought the newspaper during the time. And when you read the Federalist Papers, it's the thoughts are complex, the sentence, the grammar, the syntax. It's like, and this was at a time prior to mass education where we had universal literacy. It's like universal literacy. I think it's a euphemism. It's almost like the Ministry of Truth in 1984 or something. Like the Ministry of Truth, their purpose was to tell lies, right? The Ministry of Love the purpose was to make war. Like it's such a backwards idea. The idea of that everyone's literate today. Just go read the Federalist Papers. Try to go read them, as though you're reading the newspaper in the morning over breakfast. And it's as though you're entering into a different world entirely, where not only was everyone literate, but they were incredibly high IQ, like high functioning in their mind. They could explore philosophical, political concepts at a really great depth among the common populace.
There's definitely there's something to that. You read accounts of what people were like, even before that, in a pre-literate context. And one of the things you realize is that people had incredible mental faculties. And there's a give and take to that. Literacy is a convenient technology. It makes things remarkably easier. But it seems to be negatively correlated with your memory, that generally pre-literate people have incredible memories. You know, you look at something even like the tradition of epic poetry.
Yeah.
Again, primarily in pre-literate societies, you would have
My mind went right
bards
there.
who could rattle off, you know, effectively hundreds of pages of information. Now, admittedly, that it's designed to be memorized. There's certain, you know, motifs built into it that are helpful, but nonetheless, right, that speaks to something that is lost. Now, similarly, digital technology is remarkably convenient. For instance, I mean, this would be a much slower conversation if you and I were corresponding by mail, but albeit that seems to erode and attack the human capacity to pay attention to anything. I'm a Zoomer. I am guilty of this. My attention span has been completely ruined by the internet. I get that. But again, it seems as if in all ages, we are fundamentally dealing with an unequal humanity, right? People are not all the same. And we can delude ourselves about that. We can delude ourselves into the idea that we can make every man a scholar. But we've run the experiment, and what's happened? I mean, we've wasted a lot of money. You know, we've wasted a lot of people's time, but humans are still humans. So, Thomas, we are fast approaching time. This was a really fun conversation. It went a different direction than I thought. But if people want to find you, maybe a poor choice of words, if people are interested in your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
I am actually, you can find me on Facebook under my name. You can also find me on Twitter now. I'm back on Twitter under my name. And